Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So, good afternoon and welcome to another one of the Microsoft Research Colloquium series. For those who don't spend time here, this is Microsoft Research, and we are located upstairs, filled with a lot of different folks. This is one of the talks that is sort of more on the social media end of the spectrum for Microsoft Research. For those who are less familiar with social media type talks, or talks that are not theoretical computer science, the thing to know is that the arc of a talk means that you can actually follow what goes on if you don't understand the first slide. So my request to each and every one of you is to actually take a moment and let Jeff actually sort of open up his talk before we start interrupting with questions. It is with great pleasure that I get to welcome Jeff Hancock here. He's been here this week and he'll continue to stay on for those who want to talk to him further. Jeff is actually you're a professor of communications and collection?
And information science
and
cognitive science.
It seems to keep adding departments. And Jeff is at Cornell University, and his work is primarily interested in issues around deception.
Thanks, Dana, and thank you for having me here. It's been wonderful. And I know you guys are hiring, so you have a lot of talks this week, 3 that I could see on the schedule. So today I would take it easy on you. I won't go over my theoretical computational analysis of lying. Just kidding, I don't have one. But I would also decided to give you a more sort of a fun, popular thing. So we'll do a few experiments and things like that over the course of the day. So yes, deception. It seems like there isn't a day in the news that, or a week that one doesn't go by. This is Bernie Madoff, and perhaps the most expensive deception that humanity's ever witnessed. And very low tech. There were technology involved, but it was literally like paper and pencil kind of things that he did. Tiger, also big deception, perhaps the biggest in recent memory. And he was caught out with a voicemail that was sort of heard around the world. I don't know, has anybody listened to the actual voicemail? It's sort of fascinating to hear this like guy and just in this intimate moment. So deception's everywhere. It's part of like essentially every scandal that ever takes place these days. And at the same time, we've got, oh, this is being cut off. I wonder if there's a way to reframe that. How do we go to, it doesn't matter, we'll survive. We think about deception as like this thing that is occurring more and more, and the modern world is like this super deceptive thing, and back in the day it was more honest. Well, this is Diogenes here. You may recognize him, some of you Greek classicists. Does anybody remember what Diogenes was doing with his lantern?
Looking for an honest man.
He was looking for an honest man, but that's right. Did he ever find one?
I don't think so.
He never did. He died looking. And this is back on Crete, right? And so even back then, the Greeks were concerned with the proliferation of deception in their society. Well, it's, this is all totally cut off, but there must be a way to quickly switch it around. I'm not sure. If you could ask Jeff if he could pop over. Thanks. So lying is this very pervasive sort of phenomena. It's everywhere, and it's ancient. It's very much a part of humans and human history. And now at the same time, we have this thing. You may recall what this is. Does anybody, Butler, do you remember what this was? Telephone. And it has now become ubiquitous. If I were to ask all of you to open up your pockets and purses, there would be a communication device of some kind for each person. Some of you may not have one, but that's okay. Other people in the room would have more than one, so it would average out. And this sort of stuff is ubiquitous. There's a recent New York Times article that if your kids are not, if they're awake, then they're probably online. Technology is pervading all aspects of our lives. So it's ubiquitous. Technology, and turns out deception is also ubiquitous. And the talk today is about what happens when those two things collide. What's the intersection of deception and technology, two pervasive modern phenomena here? Well, we've all seen spam. So here's a nice family trying to get my bank information. So we see lots of examples in which the internet kind of plays a role in facilitating deception. Here's a real company called Alibi Network. They're in Chicago. And this is a company where you can pay them to do some deceptions for you. So if I wanted Dana to think that I was in New York instead of in Boston, I could call them up and say, here, I need a number for the New York Hilton. And I could then give that number to Dana. And when she called that number, this company would answer and say, hello, New York Hilton. And she'd say, could I have Jeff Hancock's room? And they would patch her through to wherever I was, say here, by dialing into my number here. And that would cost me about $400. So this company uses the technology of a whole variety of things to help you lie. This is a company that actually didn't end up going live because the New York Times exposed it and it got a lot of negative publicity, but you could buy a friend on Friendster for 99 cents a month, on MySpace, and I believe they had Facebook planned as well. And for 99 cents a month, you have a friend that would post things regularly and make you look more popular. Now those are sort of the fun trivial ways, but it turns out there's some also interesting national security concerns here. So this is a message that I received from a government agency out of a bunch. Perfect, thank you. That I had to sort of attempt to decode, and my group couldn't do it. We do some linguistic work that I'll show you. But here's what the coding was that we weren't able to crack. I have to get some glasses before I get incense for the wedding on Thursday. And glasses refers to the city of glass, which is Hong Kong. Incense, there's a huge incense bazaar in Bangkok. And wedding is the bombing event. Thursday is the day. So you have a 2-day itinerary of a terrorist that's coded in culturally embedded semantics. And so a question here is, well, they're using technology to sort of facilitate their ability to organize. That's a real one. At the same time that we can see how technology makes it easier for us to lie, we see tons of examples of extreme intimacy and honesty and self-disclosure online. So this is from a blog called Post Secret. Every Sunday there's new postcards anonymously put up. This one said, after I was date raped, I dated and slept with the guy that did it 3 more times. I hope that if I could make it a real relationship, I wouldn't have to admit to myself that the rape was real. The sort of thing that we wouldn't even really say to close family and friends, probably to a therapist perhaps. Yet this person is put in a place that has a website that's read by millions of people every week. This is an example of a net blog. So this person here, who is identified, not anonymous, is posting all of their assets down to the dollar, all of their debts, and is tracking how much they're spending. This is their debt. So they start off at minus 55 and down to minus 35 for anybody to see. That's in dollars, yeah. So she was down $55,000 and now she's up at $35,000. And we see diet blogs. We see all these things where people are exposing sort of these we would traditionally consider private things online. This is one of my former honors students. Brilliant, studied deception with me, great student. And she has 614 photos at this point online, and it wasn't a closed Facebook account. So here we are seeing a lot of people that are just putting things up. What is it about the internet that allows us to use all this technology for deception and also for honesty? So to examine that kind of question, we're going to call something digital deception. And to give you a little history about why I would study something like digital deception, I was a customs officer. I was telling Dana back in Canada while I was in finishing university. I was a customs officer working at the border, protecting Canadians from you Americans, and basically arresting people for having guns or bringing drugs in, kind of thing. And I started studying how people interact online and put the two together. And this is what we'll be talking about today then, and my history came to this. Digital deception is intentionally misleading someone in a mediated communication. 2 components to this that are important. The intentional aspect. So if I mislead you to say that the talk was at 5, but it was actually at 4, well, that's not deception, that's a mistake. Same with irony and sarcasm. I don't intend for you to have a false belief. The misleading aspect is the false belief part. Deception is really comes down to creating a false belief. Something you're getting somebody else to believe something that you know not to be true. And there's many ways to do that. And we'll look at 2 sides of it. I like looking at the practices, how people go about lying, and we'll also look at detection, if there's any ways to actually detect deception. Oh, media is just assumed. We're at Microsoft. But yes, actually, media is a really important thing. Yeah, so the telephone, for example, is mediated. Email, video conferencing, a blog, any space where we're not in the same physically co-present space. Yes. Yes. Pardon?
It's in a book, it's mediated.
If it's in a book, it's mediated. I would have to say yes. That, according to this definition, that would be true. Yeah. So we're going to look at a couple of questions. One is, how does technology affect when we lie? The other is about how we present ourselves to the world. And on the detection side, it's what are the cues that we can look at for deception? And is it possible to do detection in a digital sort of world where, like the internet, for example, messages on the internet? Yes, Dana and I have been talking about that. So the way I consider it, and this is pretty common in psychology, is deception is the overarching category. Lying is the category within it, a subcategory, that's verbal. So lying requires a statement of some kind. Yeah. Let's take a look at the practices first, and maybe this will help us clarify some of these other questions. Here's your first question. I want to see how smart Microsoft research is. How does technology affect our lying behavior? Will we lie most face-to-face, on the phone, in instant messaging, in email, or people never lie? And I'll just tell you right off the bat that one of those is wrong. And then when we think about things like email, let's ignore spam for now. Let's think about when we're interacting with people we know, where do we lie the most? I'll give you a few seconds. All right. Now you have to raise your hand. I will come for you and make it embarrassing for you if you don't over the next 4 options. Face-to-face? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Phone? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Instant messaging? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And email? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Well, pretty equal distribution, with phone having the least, I would say, and instant messaging, email the most. Face-to-face in the middle. Let's take a look. I was sort of a little bit glib with you because we need to think about how many times we actually interact in this space. Turns out, despite all this wonderful technology, we still have most of our interactions face-to-face. And we can think about how many lies take place divided by the number of interactions that take place in a space. So if I'm a hermit and I talk twice and I lie once, that's 50% in that space. Let's say there's Dana, she talks all the time, and she has 10 conversations and lies once. That's 10%. So 50% versus 10%, and all that changes how much we talk. And we want to take a look at this across different media. And I left that in here. Well, I put this in here because of Butler. Now we're going to go over some theory, social science theory, and see how it's useful and whether we can prove some of it wrong. One theory, social distance theory, is that lying makes us uncomfortable, and to reduce that discomfort, we should use technology to distance other people from us, reduce that discomfort. Okay, so I've lined up the media by distance. I'm not going to go over that because I think it's pretty straightforward, but email is more distant than the other ones and so on. And if that's the case, then those of you that raised your hand, the 7 of you that raised your hand, email will be the place where people lie the most, and face-to-face would be the least. Now there's an opposing theory that comes out of management and organization science called media richness theory. This idea is that you match the medium to the amount of complexity of the communication task. So if I want to meet Dana for lunch, I should use a very simple medium, a very lean medium like email, because that's a simple task. If I want to break up with her when she's my girlfriend, then I should probably do that face-to-face, although some jerks will do that in a lean medium, but a more complex task. So if deception is a complex task, then you should do most of your lying face-to-face. And this sort of makes sense, actually, because if I'm lying to Butler and I see that he's not really buying what I'm selling, then I can adjust my strategy. I can change what's going on. If I send an email, then what? Exactly right. Exactly right. It's so clever that you say that. Now, what I often do is ask people why they said the various things. So perhaps I will. We've got recordability. So you obviously did not say email when you didn't think email would be the place. Phone is very good. That's correct. So the telephone, half of the United States, or the states in the U.S., you are allowed to record phone calls. It's one-party consent. But most people never do. So you're absolutely right. Phone is very good in that it doesn't record things. But let's take a look at these different features. If all of you made some calculation about where people would lie, it was evenly split pretty much across the group. Well, we can take a look at the literature and say, well, what features of a medium should increase lying? I have synchronicity there. It turns out most lies that we tell are small little lies, and they're ones that kind of emerge in conversation. So if I ask Christian, what do you think of my jacket? He actually hates black and gray combinations, but he likes me. He doesn't want me to feel bad, so he says, hey, you look good.
It would be fine if the pants would match.
Or he would be honest and not lie at all. So in asynchronous environments, you're less likely to experience this sort of thing, these small lies. I have N here under instant messaging because it's sort of near synchronous. It's in between. So it's partly synchronous. Now recordability, exactly what you were saying. A lot of people, when they say, oh, they think email or instant messaging is where people lie the most, they're thinking about cues, and that is that we can detect the other person. So if you go into a more anonymous sort of space or a space where you can't see nonverbal cues, people should lie more because you can't tell. Well, that's a possibility, but a more important one is whether a record is kept. And many a politician has found out the hard way that when you do a lie in email or in instant messaging and somebody knows how to do log file, you're screwed. So you shouldn't lie in places that have a record. Last is distributed. If we're in the same physical space, co-present, there's a lot of things I can't lie to you about. I can't lie about what I'm wearing, can't lie about who I'm with, what I'm doing, any of that sort of stuff. As soon as we're distributed, I can lie about those other things. So the way we go about testing this is we have PDAs that we give people, and after every conversation I'd say I'm talking to Carrie, and then afterwards I would turn around and I'd be like, I just had a conversation, I lied, it was face-to-face. And then that would get downloaded, and we would analyze those things. And we have a bunch of other kind of questions like, was it a friend or family, and how big was the lie, etc. But let's just focus on frequency. Here's our theories that came from the literature, Butler. And what we can do is actually prove these right or wrong, right? We can support them or we can prove them wrong. Here's what the data look like. So the phone is 37%, and this study's been replicated about 5 or 6 times now in a couple of different countries. Phone is always the place that has the most self-reported lying. And this is after everything, it's a diary study over 7 days. So phone is always the place where people lie, and it's always by the most. Face-to-face and instant messaging tend to come out in the middle, and email is the place where people lie the most, although it's changing a little bit in the last year or two. But this is a pretty common pattern. So we can take a look at the theories, and social distance theory is doing pretty well. Face-to-face to phone, it increases. But then you go into cyberspace, and it does terribly, so we can get rid of that theory. Media richness theory actually does very well. It's really kind of generally consistent, but it would have predicted face-to-face would be the highest. So it's clearly not a very good predictor either. Now, my theory, on the other hand, fits almost perfectly. What's that, Christian?
Your theory doesn't really predict the slope, just the tendency that that's up or down.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, presenting it as a slope is incorrect, actually. These should be bar graphs, technically, but for presentation purposes, I chose lines. So yeah, exactly. So I predicted that the phone would be the place where people lie the most, and email would be the least. As I said, this has been replicated a number of times, not only in my lab, but other labs in other countries. And it's also, I mean, like I said, you just see this all the time. So here's a piece in the New York Times again. Divorce lawyers in New York now say that over half of divorce cases involve email or text messaging. And lawyers tend to consider the E in email to stand for evidence rather than electronic. It's very difficult to get rid of these things. Once they're digital, it's searchable and never goes away. So that's sort of about how media can affect how often we lie. And there's you can think of a lot of other ways to look at, like how important were the lies, how planned, to family or friends, those sort of things. But let's move on to one other question, because I want to keep it moving. And that is, how does it affect the way we present ourselves? So I'm presenting myself to you now. I'm again wearing this stuff. I thought about that when I woke up. All of you are wearing clothes, it turns out. And all of you wearing clothes are making some choices about how you present yourselves in the real world. We're all having to do that now in the virtual world. Everybody has a page. Most people have more than one page. Here's the president. He has a Facebook profile, and this is what he looks like and how he's presenting himself to the world. Here's my LinkedIn profile. So I don't even look like myself really anymore. But this has information about me and who I'm with. And another big important kind of self-presentation is online dating. So here's a woman that's representing various facts about herself, how old she is, what her body looks like, what her height is, and she says some things about the kinds of sunsets and beaches she likes. And what's really interesting there is we can break this down and start saying, well, how does the fact that we're on the internet affect the way we sort of lie about the way we present ourselves? And to do that, we want to think, first of all, about what are the goals that people have. So in this one, she needs to appear attractive. She's doing online dating. One of the goals here is to find a romantic partner. and so appear attractive. And that's pretty easy to do in this way because I can edit it, I can take my time doing it, and I can use whatever format I want. I can put up photos, I can use somebody else's photo, that sort of thing. At the same time, though, another goal is to appear honest. If I get a date and I go to lunch and I don't look anything like what I said I was, then that date isn't going to go any further than coffee. So I'll ultimately fail in what I'm trying to do, which is to have some romantic connection. So I also need to appear honest. And there are also gendered goals that come from evolutionary psychology. And I don't have a huge dog in the evolutionary psychology fight. It just happens to be a good sort of explanation or framework to explain differences between men and women's preferences. So female tend to prefer taller men. Evolutionary psychologists would argue this is because it was a very good predictor of status. Although Jennifer was telling me that it's a better predictor of the height when you're 16 will predict your income when you're older more than your current height. But I just learned that the other day. Whereas males prefer more slender women, hourglass figure. They've done analysis of poetry going back to the 16th century, and this seems to be a fairly constant preference for men. So those are goals. You need to present yourself that way. Now, if you're thinking about a deception strategy and you just think about goals, if your first goal is to appear attractive, what should your deception strategy be? Thinking of no other goals, what should your strategy be? Fabricate your photo. Should you lie a little or a lot? You should lie a ton, right? If your strategy is to... What's that?
It should be reasonable, right?
Well, that's not... But not for this first goal. If I want to appear attractive, I should lie a lot. I should...
You're saying you can't be 8 feet tall.
I can't be 8 feet tall.
No, that would be weird. So presumably there is a bell curve that you want to be working on. But you should lie frequently. If your goal is to appear attractive, you should lie frequently. But that goal interacts with the second goal, which is to appear honest. And so if you need to consider both of those goals, what do you need to do now? And Christian was on the right track here. You need to lie consistently, and in a sort of a small way, you need to lie subtly. Right? So if you lie in a way that's too much, then when you meet, you don't appear honest, and that goal's failed. So you need to lie frequently, lie subtly. These are the strategies to map onto those goals. Women should lie about their weight and age, and men should lie about their height. Okay, so if you match strategy to goals. Yeah.
Is this about lying within the confines of your social environment? Like it's acceptable to lie this much on Match.com, but it'd be too much like...
Right. I think that norms play a huge role, and we're going to ignore them for now. Because it's been very difficult to actually assess norms across different sites. When we look at these, we looked at 5 different sites. I won't present that data, but the deception sort of patterns were identical across the 5. Probably because there weren't, sufficient cultural differences there. So I don't want to make any claims about that. But you must be right. I just don't have any data on that.
How did you find out whether people were lying? Did you get
That is such a good question. Well, the way we went and did that was we asked people to come and be a part of a study. We tried to do this in New York. We needed online daters, and we were going to pay them $30. We tried for 3 weeks, didn't find one online dater in Ithaca. They're all busy tending their sheep and cows, I guess. So we went to New York City and to the new school and used the lab there, and we had people come in to the lab. Before they came in, we downloaded their profile, and then when they came into the lab, we measured their height, put them on a scale, got their weight, we got their age from their driver's license, got them to fill out an income tax form so we could get their income, and we took a photograph of them. And what we could do then was sort of compare, here's what you said you were online, and here's what we measure you to be. All right? Because one of my frustrations with deception research is we either ask people to lie for us, which means they're pretending to lie in a way, or we ask them to tell us about their lies, which means we're asking them to be honest about their lying behavior, which is also weird. And this one is a nice one where it says, here's what you said, this is what you actually are in physical space, and we can do some analysis.
Wait, but you can't use deception in doing these studies.
You can. You just need IRB approval. You can. You have to justify it, though, and there's very careful debriefing procedures.
So aren't you going to have a sampling bias? Because if I'm a huge liar, I'm not going to come into your lab and show you.
Well, I think there will be a sampling bias, but not because of that reason. They didn't know anything about deception when they were coming to the study. We asked people that have been online dating for, I think they had been doing it for at least 2 months, and we were interested in talking about their experiences as online daters, and we were going to pay them some money. So there shouldn't be any sample bias in that regard. But are rich people going to come and do this for $30? No. Right? So we do have some sample bias, but not for that reason, I don't think. All right. Yes.
Did anybody refuse to participate and show up and discover that you were going to measure them in a way that would make them fill out income tax stuff and then just leave?
Well, so of the 90 people that ended up completing the study, 2 refused to have their measurements taken. Of the income tax one, almost everywhere, there were 10 people who refused to fill out the income tax. When we ended up getting all of the income forms from the IRS, about half of them were erroneous, so people lied to us, gave them the wrong Social Security number. So, but you know, in terms of height and weight and age, we got that pretty solid.
Why would IRS review the income tax of people?
Oh, I wanted to find out if men lied more about their income than women did.
No, but you can just go to the IRS and say, can you tell me what Christian's income tax last year was?
I can't. I have to have permission from you to do it, which is the letter I was getting them to sign.
Oh, I see.
Yep. Okay, so we can do a frequency thing and say, all right, let's say that when you're lying about height, how do we calculate that? We say, well, if you're 10 pounds more or less than what you said, then that's a lie. With height is were you an inch more or less, so above or less, then that would be a lie. And age is were you that age that year. And people can quibble about, like, is a 20-pound range, is that line? And we don't think so. There's a number of reasons. One is that we also asked them to self-report how accurate their profile was, and it correlated with what we found. So that when we found them to be lying, they also thought they were lying. And what we can see here, what the most important are, the little circles and things are off. But if we just look across, like, did you lie on any of these categories, we found that about 80% of people lied on at least one category. That is, they were sufficiently different from what they said on their profile to be considered, in our view, deceptive. For age was, were you that age when we measured, when you came into the lab? So if I said I was 31, was I 31 the day I came in? Yeah, that's right. Yep. Now here's all the data on height. These are the women and these are the men. And this is how tall they were when we measured them. And this is how tall they said they were on the profile. And each dot represents a person. If their dot lies on that line, that's like the truth line, then they were very accurate in what they reported saying in terms of their height. And you can see for women that actually it's pretty randomly distributed above and below the line. There's not much of a pattern. This person, for example, is 3 inches shorter than what they said they were. So for women, there's not much of a pattern. But for men, if you take a look, they're all sort of clumping below the line. And that's because men tend to lie about how tall they are by saying they're taller than they actually are. And the average was 9/10 of an inch. So we call that strong rounding up. You know, like you get to 5'9" and 1/10, 5'10". So that's the men. Now if we take a look at the women, it's a very different story. So they tend to clump on weight. And they're clumping all up above the line. Anybody up in this half of the graph, they're lying about how much they weigh. They are saying that they are lighter than they actually are. And as you can see, the heavier somebody gets, the more they do that. Men show a little bit of a different pattern. The line has sort of been shifted a little bit so that, yes, the really big, heavy guys tend to say that they're lighter than they actually are, but the skinny little dudes, they're actually saying that they're heavier than they are. So they're sort of regressing towards the mean there. Age, we expected women to lie more about age, and we found very little age deception. Any thoughts as to why we might see less age deception than say, height and weight?
Easiest one to actually confirm.
Yeah, exactly. It's confirmable, verifiable, and also it's difficult to change. So when we interviewed people, we'd ask them, well, why did you say this weight or whatever? And some women would say, like, I say that weight because if I get a date, that's my goal in dieting. I will diet down to that weight. So you can change your height and weight, but you can't change age. Now this is our biggest whopper. That was 10 years. This was about 6. So there were some people that had some pretty serious lies, but most people were right on the line. Well, it depends on how you're thinking about targets. I mean, some people prefer much younger, you know, or much older.
Right, but if you're, I guess that's true.
Yeah. There's no one optimal connection. Okay, so then that's online dating. People lie in a very predictable way. When we look at what the goals are, they do exactly what they are. And yes, people lie a lot in online dating, but we tend to conflate a lot to be both frequent and big. But what we found was frequent lies, but quite subtle. So not these big, huge whoppers that we hear about. We've just finished a study on resumes, and I'll tell you very quickly about it, not show you too much data. We had people compete for a job at Cornell, and they filled out a resume either using LinkedIn, in which they had to provide links to people, so former friends, colleagues, bosses, etc., or a traditional paper-based resume. All the information they had to provide was identical. It was just whether or not it was online and had links or not. And we were examining, then had them tell us about the lies that they told after the fact. And whether it was a LinkedIn resume or a paper-based resume, the students lied about 3 times. Okay, so both kinds was 3. But what we found for the LinkedIn ones was most of the lies were about interests and hobbies, things that are not that relevant to the job. When we looked at the paper-based lies, they were the things that were central to the job, typically your previous responsibilities, your previous involvement in previous jobs, and your skills. So what we found was that these LinkedIn resumes tended to include deceptions that were less important, less central to the job. So we can also see how things like links to like social network information can constrain lying, or at least shape it in ways that can be interesting. All right, that's practices. That's sort of like how we go about lying and how we present ourselves using deception. What about the detection side? And the detection is what a lot of people are really interested about, and we're going to do a little bit of experiments here. So you have to find a partner. You two, for example. Everybody find a partner. Find a partner. I know, it's a lonely world. Get a friend. Friends, get a partner. Don't be all like, oh, I don't need a partner. You need a partner. I will make it embarrassing for you if you don't. Carrie and Dana, you guys are just match made in heaven. Now, this is not the hard part of the experiment, but you need to do this as well. So determine which partner has the lightest colored shirt. This shouldn't take too long. Now, the person with the lightest colored shirt, I want you to start. Have you everybody determined lighter color? Okay. Think of a trip you went on recently. All right. Dark colored shirts, I want you to close your eyes. Close your eyes. Don't open your eyes until I tell you. Remember, I say deception. I'll be able to tell if you open your eyes. So dark colored shirts, your eyes are closed. Keep them closed. Light colored shirts, I have instructions on the screen. So this would be the, all right. Okay, so you got the instructions on the screen. Okay, light colored shirts, you can get ready for your story. Dark colored shirts, open your eyes. Light colored shirts, tell your partner about a trip you went on recently. You got 2 minutes. Do you not have a partner? Oh. Did you tell your story already? Tell a different story. Yeah, try. You can do it. Think of a previous trip when you were a kid, maybe. He hasn't been with you since a kid, right? Think of any story. Anyone will be good. Okay, start wrapping up the story. And get to the old finale. All right. Now the dark color shirts. Which are you, Bo? Are you light or dark? I can't tell you. You're light. Okay, good. Now it's the dark colored shirts task. Light colored, thank you all for telling your story. That's great. Dark colored shirts. I want you to raise your hand if you think your partner was lying to you. All right. Okay, hands up. Keep the hands up. We have 4 people, 5 people. All right, let's keep the hands up. So this side of the room, you were indeed being lied to. So we have 1, 2, 3 people that were correct. This side of the room, hands up. 1, 2, you were both wrong. Okay? Both wrong. Now go ahead and debrief. People are very upset when they get lied to or lie. Go ahead and talk it out. Talk it out. This side of the room needs to become friends again. Okay. All right. Everybody's okay? Everybody all right? I know. It's very painful being lied to. All right. Now let's move on. Dark colored shirts. You just made a really hard decision. You had to decide whether another human was lying to you or not. What did you rely on? Christian? Oh. You have to decide in their face. That's right. It's not anonymous. It's like you have to accuse somebody. Christian, what did you rely on? You were actually correct?
I was correct. Well, it's sort of, the story didn't quite fit together.
Good. So there was a verbal sort of problem with it. It doesn't quite fit together. What's you got it right?
He tried to tell me too much.
He tried to tell you too much. So also a verbal thing, right? He was just piling off.
Wait a minute. She just told me that she saw the slides before.
But she didn't know which side of the room she would be on.
She knew which side of the room we were sitting on.
That's true. That's true. What about you guys? Somebody that was right? There was two people wrong on this side. What did you rely on?
I thought there's someone who's lying, so I decided to go.
To talk online, so why not go with that? Very good. Any other what cues? Anybody then? Not just dark color shirts. What do you rely on to tell if someone's lying?
Well, in this case, I tweeted, it was a conference trip, and I tweeted about it constantly, and so I fibbed only where it was.
Uh-huh.
It was in Atlanta instead of Savannah, because I figured that was like a small enough thing, and I kept talking about 35 people.
Uh-huh. So you were doing the line, and you thought of just doing it as in a small way you'd be. But she caught you anyways, because you knew that you were in Savannah. All right. So again, a verbal thing. All right. So Microsoft Research is a very verbally oriented group. If you ask this question of 77 different countries, which happened in about 2006, 77 different countries and cultures, and ask what's the cue you rely on the most, every single culture, eye gaze. Something to do with the eyes. They're shifty, they're not shifty. They look at you, they don't look at you. Eyes are the window of the soul. So you guys are actually a very unusual group. Every other place I've asked that question, everybody has always said at least once eyes. In fact, there's three ways to catch a liar. There's what they say, there's how they say it, and then there's physiological things. So this is a polygraph. Polygraph measures physiological responses to deception. It doesn't actually measure deception. It measures arousal, which is assumed to be connected to it. Now, in fact, there are no single cues, there are no Pinocchio noses related to deception, period. There are none. And it turns out that humans, even though we may rely on it, are pretty bad at detecting deception. 54% is the amount of deception detection skill humans as a race have so far. 40 years of research, about 500 studies with 4,000 trials, leads to 54% on average. Two different meta-analyses come to that. And part of the reason that it's that is the truth bias, which you guys actually displayed. We had two people here say that there were people lying, I think, or maybe three. Two people on this side. So out of the room, most people were not willing to say that their partner was lying, precisely for actually what Dana was saying. You had to do it right in somebody's face. This is very difficult. Only weirdos can do it when they're when they're. It's true. It is a special situation. Yes? Of the cues? Well, the most there's no single set even, not even one channel. Most of my work is on the verbal, and I'll talk about that in a bit. There are some nice work being done non-verbally on how hand movement of the body moves. So you can use computers to track the hands as blobs as people lie, and again, for more important lies, velocity slows down, the hands stay closer to the body. The pitch of somebody's voice goes up when people are lying. These are all sort of related to this idea of over-controlling communication. When you do that, you tend to reduce movement. The vocal cords tighten up. But most humans can't use any of this information. Yep.
Do we see base rate abuse in this kind of deception? So if you told the room that half of us were lying,
right.
We still...
Base rate at about 98% predicts exactly what your level of detection will be. So if I tell you that 9 out of 10 people in the room are going to be lying, then you will you'll score it. You'll get 90 out of 100 right. You'll get.
So what's the 54%? 54%?
54% is when you have an equal opportunity of being correct. So you could either be lying or telling the truth. Then it's 54%. You can convert, almost all of them have a baseline of 50%. Now this 54% is actually significantly different from chance. So this number is not chance. It's effectively chance, but it's not. And there's a couple of reasons why that might be that's come out in the literature right now. One is wizards. So these are people that are very good at detecting them. 15,000 people have been tested on a series of videos, and people that can get over 80% both times are called wizards. And there's 18 out of the 15,000 that have been tested. So they're very rare. There's some argument right now about whether they're just a statistical anomaly. There doesn't seem to be any pattern as to why they are. There's some cops, there's some therapists, there's some kindergarten teacher. You know, there's nothing. We don't know why they're wizards yet.
Are these, by the way, face-to-face or not face-to-face?
They're viewing videos.
I see. So if there would be some kind of femtoron if you lie, is that not?
Perhaps, but unlikely. But you're right. It's certainly a possibility. The other side is that there could be transparent liars. And these are people that are very bad at lying. Most of us are very good at it. We don't have any problems. I'm a person that has no trouble lying. My wife, Amy, who Dana has met, she's not such a good liar. Christian apparently has a smile that he gives off whenever he lies, just so you guys all know that now. And this could be another reason is that, you know, when I have to detect, say, Dana or Butler or anybody else that I know or Carrie, never get them. But when Christian tries to lie to me, I get him every time. And that gives me this little 4% bump. We don't know what those two things are, but the main point is that we think that we can detect things. When I ask them, where do you think we'll lie the most, and they say email or instant messaging, it's because they believe that I can tell when somebody's lying. And like I say, most people cannot. All right, well, so let's move into the digital space where those most of those cues go away anyways, and all we're left with typically are verbal things. The internet is primarily a verbal space. Photos have come in big now, YouTube so it is starting to change, but really it's about traces of text. And here's that online dating profile, and there's some text there. And the question is, can we take advantage of some of the NLP and classification advances that computer scientists have made to start getting access to these sort of things? So one of the projects that I work on is trying to see if we can look at messages to detect some kind of hidden code like this or deception. So the question is, can we look at linguistic traces of deception in messages? And we can take computerized language analysis, so using NLP, natural language processing, which has made huge advances lately, and combine that with data mining techniques, so statistical classification of a variety of sorts. We rely primarily on support vector machines and the stuff I'll tell you about. But to keep it simple, this is what we do. We have a couple of ways to look at deception. One is I bring them into my lab and I ask one person to not tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth on some things that they're going to talk with their partner. And then this other person is blind to that condition and is told just to talk, which is how people interact online. And in this kind of study, what we can do is take the text of the person when they're lying, take the text of the person when they're telling the truth, and use this incredibly simple but incredibly effective word counting tool called LINQ, Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count. It's very dumb. It just literally takes characters that are differentiated by spaces, so it says, oh, that's a word, and it tries to match it to a dictionary that's got about 74 different characters, or 74 different categories. And we can tell it to take a look at some things that we think are important. We look at about 60 different things, but these are three that are very common and powerful that we've seen in a number of different cases. So first person, things like I, we, me, this seems to decrease when people are lying. And this is one of our most powerful cues across spaces. When people lie, they psychologically distance themselves from the lie. This is the theory. And when you do that, you say statements that include I and me less often than when you're telling the truth. And it's really important to know that pronouns are non-consciously produced. You guys would have no idea how often I've said I or me in this talk, and you'd have also no idea how many times you say it. It's one of the things that are invisible. They're called function words, these small words between bigger words. We don't pay attention to them.
No, I'm not. Much of I or me, mostly use we or in my lab.
I'm sorry, that's what you're saying that I do?
I don't think you use much of I or me. You mostly use we.
Well, you may be right, but I don't think you know. And it's not that I think there's anything wrong with you or that you have a special anything. Think about anybody that speaks.
I heard him say I a few times at least.
I did say I a few times at least, but you got. My point is, well, let's say put it this way: there's 500 function words. Typically, it depends on which linguist you're talking to. 500 out of say about 50,000 on average that all of you would know. You would know 50,000 words. There's 500 function words. Yet they make up about 50% of all the words that we use. So there's very few of them, but they're very frequently used. And we don't handle them at the conscious level. We handle them at unconscious. So when you have a friend that's English is a second language speaker, what do they make mistakes on? He, she, right? The. They don't pay attention to those things. Yep.
What would you know that statement you just made? How is that known? How do people figure that out? That
What statement?
The fact that we don't think about using the words like we or me or I.
Psycholinguists have been showing that for about a decade, I would say. Yeah. They're completely non-consciously produced. Do you not, I mean...
I don't know what that means, but we can talk about that.
Okay, it means that it's automatic. I think about the word walk. I'm going to go walk somewhere. When I frame that sentence, I actually don't process or consider or think about the pronouns I'm going to put in that place. Does that make sense?
If you, for example, use the word I much too much for things where you should say we, right?
Uh-huh.
You talk about your family, you talk about your work, and all the papers, you got the results, it's not we and my collaborators. I might actually notice it.
You might notice that, where you say, wow, that person's like really focused on themselves. Yeah. Yes, Kay?
Are you influenced by Ekman's work or by, I don't know if he did a lot of this early psycholinguistic work, but he also has a television show. Or
Yeah, Lie to Me.
Inspired by him.
That's right.
So, and I'm wondering if a lot of that is proprietary or if it's
No, and
people or if
yeah, the proprietary stuff, they're actually selling all this stuff on microexpressions of the TSA that we can talk about, I think is very problematic. This work is influenced by, all the deception is influenced by Ekman in some way. Ekman kind of had this idea of leakage. That is similar to what I'm talking about here, which is that there are cognitive things that are going on that lead to changes in the way language is used. Ekman's focus was not verbal. His was nonverbal. He was a social psychologist interested in facial expressions, nonverbal. And so for 40 years, the focus on deception was nonverbal. And that was really his influence, very powerful influence. Only in the last decade or so, people started looking at language. And in the last decade, we've sort of come to realize that a lot of language isn't consciously produced. And I think the reason Ekman and a lot of people in deception ignored words was because we thought that we knew everything that we were saying, so why would you look there? But there's this class of words. And the next one, for example, as well, exclusive words, things like however, but, except, they're also pretty non-consciously produced as well. And when we can take a look at those, as they go down, then the text or the discourse is less complex. So more of these things, it's an indicator of the complexity of the discourse. Very simple one. Yes?
Point, right?
Yeah.
Like what I've heard in workplace, right? Women tend to say more than we,
Mm-hmm.
do more collaborative work as opposed to men and say I, and they like to take credit for what they've done.
Yeah.
Have you looked at that scenario?
I haven't looked at that, but Jamie Pennebaker just had a piece out in Science, well, it was last year, and they were looking at, this idea that women talk more than men, and it's incorrect, actually. So on that case, it's very similar. Now, in terms of gendered use of pronouns, I believe there is some work that shows that they tend to use first person plural more than men. There aren't a lot of huge differences in the way men and women talk, actually. Surprisingly, yeah. Because we have these idea, right? But, yeah. So, good question. So this goes down when people lie. Exclusive words, indicator of complexity, so when people lie, they tend to have simpler statements. In fact, also, when you get people to draw out a scene where they were lying about something or where they were telling the truth, so they took a wallet, either they didn't or they did. This figure just came out. When they ask people to draw the scene when they are lying is simpler. There are fewer elements in a scene than when they're drawing something that was truthful. Lastly, and this is an Ekman thing, is that when people lie, they tend to experience negative emotions, and in a very Ekman-y sort of way, the idea is that it leaks out in your language, so people put in more negative emotion terms, like anxiety words and sad words. So we could look at a very simple model like that, and what we find is that when people lie, they use fewer first person, fewer exclusive, and more negative emotion terms. And what's really cool is I study how both the liar and the partner talk, and the partner changes the way they talk too. They use fewer first-person singular. They ask more questions in this one study that we did. Yet when we asked them, is your partner lying or not, guess how well they did? Chance. They got 50%. Yet, if we use this information, the way they talked, they would perform at around 61, 62%. Yet, they can't access that sort of linguistic information. So it's pretty cool. Now, you can use this sort of first-person exclusive word negations, very simple model, to look at, say, all of the emails in the Enron corpus. Each dot here represents an email, and there's 500,000 of them there. And as you move away from the origin, you get what they would argue would be more deceptive. And this is by some Canadians. And indeed, these messages here were the most problematic for people like Skilling and Fastow. So you can do this very quickly, very simple sort of analysis, whereas it would take, and in fact did take, an army of lawyers many months and a lot of money. So, an example in a real-world space. I don't remember what the green and blue ones.
One is lie and one is truth.
No, there's no lie or truth in here. They just ordered it by this in this three-dimensional space, which I've represented.
So you didn't check afterwards?
Afterwards, these were checked, and these ones here that are way out, away from the origin, they were the most deceptive or problematic, is what they ended up calling them. Yeah.
How much heterogeneity is there between people? I mean, maybe
Tons.
I'm not very good in kind of detecting any random person's lie, but maybe I only have to like be tuned to like a small set of people.
Right, and that's what we're working towards now, where it's very much about building baseline. So our work is now coming and merging with authorship analysis. So you can do linguistic analysis to look at authorship. And if you put that together with deception, what you're looking for is change in base rate sort of behaviors. It's still very difficult. Yeah.
And you said this 54% statistic. Is that, were these studies also done with the same people where they had to evaluate the lives of people they knew well?
That 54% would contain studies in which you were assessing, like spouses and things like that. They would be one type of many types of studies. When you know people well, there's this sort of arms race that seems to happen. So if you and I knew each other for a long time, I might know more when you're lying, but then you also know when I know that you're lying, so you start changing, you become aware, it becomes part of your common ground, so you'll lie differently. So the data are still out. There's too little of it to make a strong thing, but it looks like even if you know people really well, you're not necessarily better at detecting them. All right, to finish off, this is my favorite new data. It's also probably the most controversial, but we've been thinking about, well, what if we know that we're going to be recorded? Maybe we would just have countermeasures and you'd never speak linguistically different. I would make sure I'd say I a lot and that sort of thing. And so we were thinking about this future that probably will come soon where everything we say is recorded. And some people live in that space already, politicians. And so we found this really great database collected by a bunch of award-winning journalists in D.C. And they tracked every statement that the top 8 people in Bush's administration said in the run-up to the war on Iraq. And what they wanted to do is identify every time they said something that was demonstrably false, according to the 9/11 Commission. 2 things that they said were demonstrably false, that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and that Iraq had connections to Al-Qaeda. Okay, so the 9/11 Commission has established that wasn't the case, yet they made claims about that. Okay, and so they can track exactly how often these claims take place. So this is October 2001. This is when I believe the war begins right here. So you can see it's ramping up, and then it goes down after the war has begun. Well, that's the question, right? So there's been 2 arguments, and I'll show you an example of one of the things. So this is Cheney. Iraq is clearly, again, as the President pointed out in the State of the Union speech, very much of concern. The yellow highlighted part is what the group of journalists would identify as false. And not only do they have a robust set of programs to develop their own weapons of mass destruction, this is a place that has used it. Okay, now the administration has argued that they were mistaken. This was based on intelligence and that they made mistakes, okay? But it wasn't intentional. And if that's the case, because you remember my definition, intentionality has to be there to be deception, then these are mistakes. But if they knew about it at the time, then that would be deception. If they were mistakes, then these yellow statements shouldn't be any linguistically different than, say, the statement in front of it, right? So if I believe this and I believe this, then they should be linguistically the same. If, however, we think there's deception going on, then we should see the traces of deception here, but not in here. So using, again, that very simple model that I just described to you, we can look at all of the times that they were false, put them into a bag. Okay, these are all the false statements, and all the non-false statements in another bag, and then compare how often these three things took place. So with first person, you'll remember psychological distancing. First person goes down. And that's indeed what we found happened. So when you look at just false versus non-false, Bush, for example, would say the word "I" less when he was talking about weapons of mass destruction and links to Al-Qaeda than when he was saying things about, whether they gassed the Kurds or not. Negative emotion cues, those should go up because of the Ekman idea of leakage. And this we found a huge effect. In fact, the statistic for this, called a D statistic, effect size, was over 1, and I thought you could only go up to 1, so I had the lab rerun this. It just turns out that I'd never seen a statistical effect that big before. It means that there's 1.35 standard deviations difference there. So a really big effect there. And you could imagine there's some reasons maybe other than deception that might be there. Maybe there were, one of the reasons they wanted to sort of scare the nation and make them understand how important this was, so you could imagine some of that there. Now, exclusive words, it's one of the other types of function words non-consciously produced. We expect there to be fewer of them when there's deception. And in fact, that was the case. Yes?
Are there any differences if someone is conveying information that they don't think is true? Like if they're given poor intelligence reports
right.
and they suspect them for being false, but they don't have it?
It's a great question. I just don't think that our area has advanced far enough to look at that. Yeah. Yes? We would break them up into statement bins. So when there was a yellow statement, we would take that yellow statement, extract it, put it into this bin, and then we would take the sentences around that sentence and put it into another bin. So it has some advantages and some disadvantages. The advantage is it's the exact same language, it's the same speaker, same day, same topic, right? So a lot of controls. But we didn't go in and look at it sort of topically to see did the sentences around it actually, was it exactly the same topic? Right.
Do you start planning to lie before you actually lie, or do you?
Yeah, I have some data on that, and if we have time, I'll show you some of that. Yeah.
The corpus, is it of statements that these guys wrote themselves? Or because you can imagine public statements that whoever wrote the speech has no knowledge.
Well, that's a great question. So we broke it up into planned, so planned speeches versus spontaneous.
Okay.
And this goes away, these two go away in planned. Okay. Wait, let me just double check that. The first person, these three things here are all true and spontaneous. But when it goes to planned, these go away, but this stays, which is the least consciously produced one too. Yeah, so there are differences. And then we looked at people. So for example, Cheney versus Powell. Who do you think shows this sort of pattern more? Cheney. That's what I thought too, taking Cheney down. Not at all, the exact opposite. And if you think about it, Powell is the good soldier. What does a good soldier do? He doesn't believe it to be right, but he does it anyways. So maybe he was being the most deceptive. He shows the biggest pattern. Cheney, I think he believes it. And he doesn't talk like a normal human anyways. He never really uses first-person singular. He is the government. He is the U.S. when he talks. So it's sort of fascinating. All right. So there's that. Maybe I'll just close it up so that we can go with some questions. But, I really love this space because it's about this intersection of things that aren't going to change. Technology will continue to be ubiquitous and evolve with us, and lying will always be with us. And we have lots of assumptions that I've been working out with Dana that are, I think, in desperate need of re-examination, and perhaps technology will give us the opportunity to do that. So, thank you all very much. Those are my colleagues. The ones in red are undergraduates that authored papers with me. So. Good students. The black ones are graduate students, and then these are all faculty that I work with. So, yes?
A bit about egocentrism. So we know that people will overestimate how well that others understand emails that they send, for example. That leads to flames, unintentionally.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how well people can anticipate whether someone else will detect their deception.
So
I'm,
yeah.
So maybe you tell me the lie or you don't.
Yeah.
I guess whether or not the other person would guess correctly that I lied.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm sure they would. I don't know about the guessing correctly part, but I think you're probably right. Is they would think face to face, they would have they would have more confidence that they had succeeded in knowing whether or not the person caught them or not, right? Whereas in email, they would probably assume that they got away with it more frequently.
So the 4% were really bad liars. Like, do they usually know it or not?
I think they usually know it. Yeah. Did you know it? Yeah. So yeah, no, I think so. And you're referring to the Kruger and Epley stuff, right? About how they, yeah. So it's a really great question. That's a really good idea for a study where we could get them to lie to somebody in one media or not, and then ask them questions about how they thought it went. And presumably they would think that any internet-based one would be more successful. Yeah.
Maybe something about how risky their lies are would change too.
Yes, that's certainly possible too, yeah.
So I just want to go back to your example about the email where the terrorists were talking about where the event.
Right.
Suppose we knew everything about, I'm trying to understand why, supposing we knew everything about what people do when they lie to one another, does that give us some knowledge about how they will encrypt their message when they're telling the truth to each other but are going to be observed by someone else?
Right. I think that they're actually separate things. In one case, the case I study, I'm lying to you. In another case, you and I are lying to some other entity. And those are very different. And I don't think they'll lead to the same language patterns at all. But there should be differences in the way people go about doing that. So Herb Clark, Lera Boroditsky, they've done work on coded language where I have common ground and you and I want to have common ground, but we want to prevent this other person from knowing it. And so they've started to document how people talk differently when there's an overhear versus when there's not. So I think there will be ways to go there. Whether or not you'll be able to automate it, I don't know. Yeah, good point. Yes, ma'am.
So I'd like to come back to the same question, but maybe I can ask it.
Sure.
Out of the three ways, verbal, eye movements, hands movements,
Yeah, verbal, nonverbal, physiological.
which one is the most accurate?
There is no. The answer is none.
Well, you said that your trial for the verbal thing is about 61%.
That was for one study in which we had people lying to each other. And this is the thing. So like I said, with 40 years of research, now we have a pretty good idea in face-to-face research. This work is only about 6 or 7 years old. In face-to-face research, the person, the type of lie, the motivation, the sort of social psychological factors that surround the deception are much more predictive of how things will go than a channel. Does that make sense? So for instance, researchers now are working on automating analysis of all 3 channels. And the very early research is suggesting that when there's discrepancies between channels, that's a hot spot for deception. But I would think that, Ekman might say, well, the nonverbal channel is the most powerful, right? But the evidence just doesn't support that. So when you look at these meta-analyses, they can break it down by verbal, nonverbal, physiological, and you look at effect sizes, there's no difference. Yep, you're welcome. Okay.
Sometimes when people are talking to each other and they want to show what they are, show allegiance, they start mimicking each other.
Right. Yes. Yeah. So we were looking at this thing called linguistic style matching, which is when verbally I could, if I'm like this person, for example, I would speak more like him. And you can actually calculate that using these NLP techniques. And what we found in our experimental studies was that when people were lying to their partner, linguistic style matching went up significantly. Yeah. And we're trying to work on the causality question now. So presumably because we only manipulated, say, me and my partner was blind to the deception, it's presumably I'm doing something to it, though that's just a guess. We don't know causally what's happening. So am I matching him, or am I saying things in a way that makes him want to match with me? And again, you ask people and there's no difference. They don't know that they're matching more or less. Yeah, it's really easy. And most research on deception has completely ignored the partner. They focus only on the liar. And I think there's a lot of interesting information in the partner. Yeah, it's a great question. Yes, in the back.
So it seems like your research addresses the question of, given a particular corpus, how well can I detect a lie from somebody's linguistic property? Is there much research on the opposite question? You ask people to evaluate a piece of text and say, do I think they're lying? Can you get a sense of what what the words are that cause people to think they're lying, possibly incorrectly.
Yes, we just presented a paper on that at CSCW in Savannah, not Atlanta. And we could look at the online dating cues in those texts, and we could analyze them using our system of looking at, and first person singular goes down when they lied a lot about their height, weight, and age. Exclusives went down just like you'd expect. Then we showed the text to people and said, oh, what do you think? And the cues that they relied on tended to be, if they said you a lot, like second person, then they trusted them less. The more words, the more they trusted them. I'm trying to think what the other results were. Yeah, you can definitely craft things to seem more trustworthy. We've also done an examination of peer-to-peer sites. And this is where you can lend money to each other, and you said, here's why I need the money. And in that case, it seems to all be about concreteness. So articles are a really good indicator of how concrete language is. So the more those, for example, and concreteness really predicted it. We thought things like family and social and illness would predict it, and that was the exact opposite. The more you talk about the social, fluffy stuff, the less likely you were to get funding, the less money you would actually get. It was more about, tell me the details, don't tell me anything else. Don't try and give us a nice soft rationale, or don't try and get the social involved. That appeared to be. And it was a pretty good predictor, actually. Yeah.
So regarding that last point,
yeah.
You're talking about phosphor, I assume?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
That was the one.
Did you see anything about relation to deception and then later performance of the loan?
Right. Well, we don't have any deception information there. All we have is what did the person say when they asked for the loan, and how much money of the amount they were requesting had they gotten. And so we were basically looking at as the lending, how much they were lent as a trust measure, which, yeah, it's kind of a trust measure, but it's also sort of like, well, I buy that as a good business model or something, which is where we think the concreteness comes from. But yeah, we were like, oh, if you say that you broke your leg or your mother broke your leg, you need the money, that was a negative predictor of loans. Yeah. Yes?
Have you ever seen anything with feedback? Let's say someone has some, earpiece that's telling you as you're lying, well, it looks like you're kind of lying right now.
Yeah.
Have you seen anything where people might change their behavior at all? You probably know they're lying already, but
yeah.
Is that extra piece kind of...
I don't know about that specific feedback thing, but there's a whole world of interrogation and how to go about saying things to people to get them to be tripped up. So for instance, if any of you were to lie to me right now, I would not be very good at it. But if I were able to interrogate you, I might do better, especially if I could analyze your language. So the big interrogation thing that's coming out, I don't know if you saw the New York Times thing, it's talking about how the verbal is the new way to examine deception. It's about increasing cognitive load. So let's say that you stole a wallet and I wanted to tell if you were lying or not. I get you to tell me everything that was happening, and then I give you a few seconds. I'm like, okay, that's cool. Could you tell me how it happened backwards now? And when the person's telling it backwards, somebody that actually experienced the event has less cognitive load going backwards, and they speak pretty normally. But when the person that's making it up and going backwards, they have really high cognitive load, and we're just now analyzing some transcripts collected by another lab. What they found was that blinking rates go way up when they're doing the backwards part, but not the forwards part. So it's sort of cool. Yeah.
Is there a correlation of lying across different spheres? So people who tell white lies, they also tell serious lies? Or?
Well, that's a good question. So men and women lie differently, for example, across self and other lies. So men, of course, we lie about promoting ourselves, and women tend to lie more about protecting other people's feelings. And, not huge effect sizes, but there's a difference
some of the
within individual. I think there's definitely measures of proclivity to deceive and self-deception stuff, and those seem to be pretty consistent within individuals. So if you're more likely to lie about small stuff, you're more likely to lie about big stuff.
Why is that? Because in Europe, for example, you can do the.
Can you speak up just a little bit?
Yeah. So, for example, European standards and US standards on what politicians do in their private lives are very different.
Yes.
You can treat your spouse horribly, and
right.
in Europe.
Yeah.
So it must be.
There are big cultural differences that are just starting to be studied. So, for example, in China, where it's more of a collectivist culture, lies, these little white lies, are considered to be quite acceptable, right? If it's a lie to protect the other person or the relationship, it's considered very acceptable. Whereas in the U.S., more individualistic-oriented cultures, those are considered less acceptable. So I think culture does play a role in it, but we're just starting to jump into that. Yeah.
So you said you might be able to tell whether people are lying if you interrogate them.
Yes.
So is a correlation of how could you tell by how uncomfortable you make them?
No, because people react very differently. So for instance, a transparent liar like yourself gets very uncomfortable, right? And it could be because you're telling the truth, actually, and you're very uncomfortable because you're telling the truth, yet you're worried that you're going to be caught out in a lie. So arousal is actually only partially related to it.
So inducing uncomfortness is not a good thing?
No. So again, a European versus U.S. difference that Dana and I were talking about. In the U.S., there's a very sort of confrontational style of interrogation that police tend to use. Make the person uncomfortable, show their real colors. In the U.K., which tends to have much better success rates in getting confessions, is it's very much about tell me the story. What happened? Okay, well, tell me this side of the thing. And, it's very sort of like just talking, getting them much information, letting them trip themselves up. And the U.S. tends to get much higher rates of false positives. So people are like, oh my God, that guy's totally lying. But in fact, the person was just like crapping their pants because the cop is right in their face. And so this idea of torture, for example, has the same problem. You'll get many more confessions, but your false positive goes through the roof. So in Iraq, if you're torturing people, you're going to get many more instances where you think, oh, I need to send out my men to go find this terrorist, and then you send the men out, and it's a waste of time. So there's big differences in interrogation.
This reminds me a lot of an old project by Josh Berman and Amy Bruckman around the Turing game. Are you familiar with
Yeah,
that?
with the gender?
Well, it was a whole variety of different tasks. So everybody in the room is assigned, you are all now women. And in this sort of textual environment, you are to be able to answer any questions as though you are a woman.
Right.
And other people are to ask questions of it, of you. And there's sort of a fascinating dynamic of just really, most people can actually get tripped up really, really fast.
Yeah.
But there was a follow-up to it that I don't believe was ever published, which was Sandy Stone's work. And she was doing work with transgender folks in the Turing game. And found that actually you could demonstrably tell when they had actually made the transition to be living in the transition.
Yeah.
That through that living process and through the experience of sort of working out the day, they actually made the transition and in terms of the way that they answered questions and whatnot, which was fascinating.
I believe that. Jamie Pennebaker did a study of people that had sex operations, and he got their emails for a month pre and post operation. And usually with the operation, they started taking what hormone? Yeah, what hormone? And for men, it would be testosterone. Yeah. And he found that their pronoun use was radically different pre and post op and pre and post hormone taking. So I think the way you feel about who you are physiologically can affect the way you talk. Yeah. Yes?
Are there any differences in motivation for lying between face-to-face and online?
Yeah, that's a big space that we're moving into. There's been just a few studies. The motivations tend to be a little bit different. So the email sort of ones are often planned explanations, right? So although our students in our studies don't lie very often in email, almost all of them are lies to professors, and they're an explanation of some kind, like why they didn't get their homework done. And it makes a lot of sense, emails in that case. So the motivation there is to explain some behavior. Whereas in face-to-face, the motivations are much more about politeness things, making the other person feel good, protecting your own face, protecting the other person's face. But as the worlds of face-to-face and intermediate become so intermingled, I think the motivations will sort of intermingle as well. But yeah, it's a really good question.
So in other words, in email, should we actually say why we're not showing up to the meeting? Or just
in emails, people do say why they don't show up for the meeting. They make it up because they have time. Yeah. So, well, let me just show you one last quick thing because Carrie asked, and then we'll wrap it up because I know it's getting late. One of the questions that we had was whether messages change through time. So if you imagine this is a bunch of instant messages, how would deception occur? Right? So one thought is it's bursty, in that you're telling the truth and then you need to lie, so you tell all your lies right away. And then you're telling, I've got to lie again. And this is a burst hypothesis. You see it in a lot of forms of communication on the internet. But another one, which is sort of probably pragmatically more difficult but strategically smarter, is you only tell lies a little bit at a time, and you hide it in your narrative. You hide lies within truth. And so we were interested in this question, And what we did is we have this system that we've developed that every time that they send a instant message, they have to rate it for whether it was truthful or not. So no deception. And if it was deceptive, how deceptive was it? And a copy is sent to whoever they're IMing, just like normal, and another copy is sent to our server. In this case, yeah, it's a small sample, but what we looked at was these things. So a tall bar means that they were lying, and a short bar means that they reported telling the truth. And you can see it's very bursty, right? Like lots here, here, and then here's another person. You know, it's here, here, here. And in fact, when we ran the statistics, which took me forever to figure out how to do, we were thinking like, is it a bunch of different things. We did a thing called a runs test, and sure enough, it clustered. So this is much more what it looks like when people lie to get at your question there, Carrie. It seems to be much more, when you lie, it's a burst of lies rather than sort of spacing it in the truths. Yeah. What does that mean? I think cognitively, this is the easiest of the two. To try and hold on to bits of lies and hide them within truths is very difficult. For our sort of detection angle, it means that if you have a system that's like, okay, the probability of this message being a lie, and let's say it's a higher probability, then the probability of the next utterance being a deception should be automatically increased. Yeah.
This was in IM conversations?
Yep, these are IM conversations.
You kind of expect that once you tell the first lie, you're
kind of
hooked.
Hooked into it and have to continue the lie. Yeah. So there may be narrative reasons for why you see this burstiness as well. Yeah, absolutely.
Is it because the nature of IM protocol is more hard to plot, like lies explicitly? So when people just tell lie, you ask them to check whether it's lie or not, they probably just spit out some lies, and then next time they think about spit out another one.
That could be right in our lab experience, but this was in their everyday use. So they had downloaded the system, like the interface onto their machines, and this was part of their everyday use, not like part of an experiment. So they just were recording how they talk.
And also there's, do you try to run the same experiment, but as an afterward observation, as like record all the message they've been tweet or sending, and then put it on a log file and ask them again, or like interrupt their behavior?
Yeah, we do that sometimes. It's called a retrospective identification technique.
And is there any difference on this kind of?
No, there's actually fairly good convergence. We are always worried that when we ask people to self-report that they will, be biased in some ways. But if we use the diary method, the retrospective identification technique, the objective method, they all actually seem to converge fairly well. Like they're all correlated. It's not perfect. So, yeah.
So you said when people lie, they're less likely to use I, but yet they're more likely to use you.
No, less likely to use I.
Right, but more likely to use you when they're talking to you.
Well, they would use you more often if they're talking to me, I suppose, but you is not necessarily, we haven't found.
Something in answer.
Oh yeah, that's what people believe. So they use you as a cue, but it doesn't actually, yeah. And there is it's not, humans are not relying on the right cues in text, basically, typically. Yeah, right. They're the ones I was trying to remember for this fellow because we presented at Savannah, and it was just like 2 weeks ago. The cues in, say, online dating and peer-to-peer were first person singular. So if they said, I'm more, then they tended to be more accurate in their height, weight, and age descriptions. More exclusive words, however, but, except. We saw more motion words, which we don't have a very good theoretical reason for. We see it over and over again. The more motion words, the more deceptive, so you want to see fewer motion. And then the last thing with online dating, which goes against the simple model I've been describing, is usually you see more emotion words when there's more deception. People that lied a lot about their height, weight, and age, they used a lot more positive emotion terms. So there may be a self-presentational angle there. So that's what we found. And crazy, I mean, not that this is going to sound that great, but the amount of variance accounted for was about 23%. Variance in how much deception was going on was 23%, much more than typical experiments. So we would get about 68% of online dating profiles we could accurately identify as being highly deceptive or not, which is still really crappy, right? I mean, that's amazing for us. Like, statistically, we're jumping up and down with joy, but you try and rely on that system, you're going to be wrong at least a third of the time, so it's no good.
And stop everybody because Jeff is kindly going to give another talk at 7 o'clock tonight.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
But thank you so much.
Thank you guys. Great questions. Really fantastic questions.